In 1929, an American trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal published a short, cheerful article claiming that the Venetian explorer Marco Polo had personally carried pasta back to Italy from China in the year 1295. No footnotes, no sources, just a story, printed to sell more macaroni to a nation newly obsessed with Italian food. It worked. Within a few decades, that single unsourced paragraph had become one of the most widely repeated facts in the history of food. Taught in classrooms, repeated on television, printed on pasta boxes. There was only one problem. It was not true. Marco Polo never claimed to have discovered noodles in China. He never mentioned bringing any back. And pasta, in one form or another, had almost certainly already existed on Italian soil for over 1,000 years before he was even born. Think about that for a second. An entire national food myth, believed by millions of people across nearly a century, invented not by historians, but by an advertising copywriter trying to move product. And yet the legend persists to this day, printed in cookbooks, repeated by tour guides in Rome, taught as fact in classrooms that should know better. So, how did a simple noodle made from wheat and water become the subject of one of history's most stubborn food myths? And what actually happened, across 3 continents and thousands of years, to turn spaghetti into the single most consumed manufactured food on the planet? This story does not start in Venice, and it does not start in China either. Not really. It starts in a river valley in what is now Qinghai Province, in the highlands of northwest China, in a moment frozen in time roughly 4,000 years ago. In the year 2005, archaeologists excavating a site called Laja along the banks of the Yellow River uncovered something that startled the entire field of food history. Buried under nearly 10 feet of sediment, sealed by a catastrophic flood and earthquake that had struck the settlement around 2000 BCE, they found an overturned earthenware bowl. Inside it, remarkably preserved, were thin, yellow, tangled strands of noodle, roughly 50 centimeters long. The people who lived there did not know the word archaeology, and they certainly did not know they were making history. They were doing it anyway. Laboratory analysis of the starch and husk phytoliths revealed the noodles were made not from wheat, but from foxtail and broomcorn millet, grains that were notoriously difficult to bind into a dough because they lack the gluten proteins that make wheat so stretchy. Whoever made that dish had figured out through what must have been patience, trial, and generations of accumulated kitchen knowledge how to work millet flour into something that could be pulled and stretched into long strands without falling apart. That is not a small technical achievement. Modern food scientists trying to replicate the process have found it genuinely difficult. The people of Laja had solved it 4,000 years ago with nothing but their hands. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains why the discovery caused such a stir among historians in the first place. Before this bowl was studied, the earliest confirmed written references to noodle-like foods in China described a wheat dough boiled in soup, dating back roughly 2,000 years. The Laja find pushed the story back by another 2,000 years, and it did so with something historians almost never get, not a description of a food, but the fossilized food itself, sealed the moment disaster struck. Sediment analysis suggests the settlement was destroyed suddenly, most likely by a combination of earthquake and catastrophic flooding along the Yellow River, a river with such a violent flooding history that later generations nicknamed it China's Sorrow. Whoever was eating that bowl of noodles never got to finish the meal. 4,000 years later, that unfinished meal became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the entire history of food. This is where the story could simply end, with a tidy origin point in ancient China. But food history is rarely tidy, and roughly 2,000 miles to the west, on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, an entirely separate and unrelated culinary tradition was quietly developing its own version of stretched boiled dough, apparently without any contact between the two civilizations at all. The Etruscans and later the Romans left behind writings describing a dish called Laganon, or in Latin, Lagana. Broad, flat sheets of dough made from flour and water, cut into strips and either baked or fried. The Roman writer Apicius, whose cookbook survives in fragments from around the 4th century, includes recipes calling for layers of Lagana. But here is the detail that trips people up. There is a meaningful difference between Lagana and the pasta you know today. Roman Lagana was typically baked or fried, not boiled, closer in preparation to a flatbread or an early lasagna sheet than to spaghetti twirled onto a fork. The leap from flat, dried dough to a boiled noodle, stored dry and reconstituted in hot water, most likely required innovations that came later, and from a different direction entirely. And that direction, somewhat inconveniently for national pride on all sides, was the Arab world. By the 9th century, the Arab conquest and settlement of Sicily had introduced an entirely new agricultural and culinary infrastructure to the island. Irrigation systems, citrus groves, sugarcane, and crucially, large-scale cultivation of durum wheat, the hard, high-protein wheat variety that produces the golden semolina flour still used in dried pasta production today. Durum wheat matters here more than almost any other single ingredient in this story, because unlike the soft wheat used for most European bread, durum's high gluten content allows dough to be extruded, dried, and stored for months or even years without spoiling or crumbling. This was not a minor technical detail. In a world without refrigeration and without reliable food preservation, a wheat product that could survive a long sea voyage or a hard winter was not a luxury. It was the difference between a besieged city surviving and a besieged city starving. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. Dried pasta's rise through medieval Christian Europe was helped along, oddly enough, by the Catholic Church's own calendar. Under medieval fasting rules, meat, eggs, and animal fat were forbidden on a large number of days each year, including all of Lent, and dried pasta made simply from durum wheat and water fit neatly within those restrictions. A food born in Muslim Sicily ended up quietly reinforcing Catholic fasting discipline across the rest of the peninsula, which is the kind of irony this channel tends to enjoy pointing out. The word pasta itself simply means dough or paste in Italian, a plain, almost boring word for something that would eventually carry so much cultural weight, while the word macaroni likely derives from a Greek or Sicilian dialect term connected to blessed or fortunate food, though etymologists still debate the exact root. The earliest solid written evidence of dried pasta as a distinct storable commodity comes from the 12th century. From the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi, who was working at the court of the Norman king Roger II in Palermo. In his 1154 geographical work, al-Idrisi describes a town near Palermo called Trebia, where in his words, they produced a food made of flour in the form of strings called ytria and exported it by the shipload to Calabria and to Muslim and Christian lands across the Mediterranean. Ytria, a word that almost certainly gives us the modern Sicilian word for a type of pasta, tria. Here is the detail worth sitting with for a moment. Dried, exportable pasta, made in industrial quantities and shipped commercially across the Mediterranean, was documented in Sicily over a full century before Marco Polo ever set foot in China. The myth was not just unsupported, it was chronologically impossible. And here is the part that should genuinely bother anyone who has taught the Marco Polo story as settled fact. Marco Polo's own account of his travels, dictated to a writer named Rustichello da Pisa after his return, and known today as the Book of Marvels, does describe a starch-based food he encountered, most likely made from the pith of a sago palm, that he compared to flour and bread. He never claimed to have introduced anything resembling it back to Italy, and nowhere in the surviving manuscripts does he take credit for bringing noodles, dumplings, or dried pasta of any kind back to Venice. The entire chain connecting Marco Polo to spaghetti was constructed roughly 6 centuries after his death by an advertising writer with a magazine to sell. By the late medieval period, dried pasta had spread from Sicily up through the Italian peninsula, carried along the same trade routes that moved spices, textiles, and Sicilian sugar. Genoa became a major hub of pasta trading and production by the 13th century, with notarial records from 1279 mentioning a chest of dried pasta, referred to as macaronis, listed among a deceased Genoese soldier's possessions. A small, almost accidental piece of evidence that the food was common enough to be part of an ordinary estate. This is where the story takes on a wider economic dimension, because Genoa in this period was not just a city. It was one of the great maritime trading powers of the Mediterranean, with merchant fleets moving grain, wool, and manufactured goods between North Africa, the Iberian coast, and the eastern Mediterranean. Dried pasta fit naturally into that trading network for exactly the same reason it had suited Sicilian exporters a century earlier. It did not spoil on long voyages. It required no refrigeration, no ice, no salt curing, only a dry hold in a sealed container. A besieged garrison or a storm-delayed merchant vessel could survive for weeks on a food that most history books, even now, barely bother to mention. And yet, for centuries, this cheap, filling, shelf-stable food carried almost none of the prestige attached to spices, sugar, or silk. Pasta was food for sailors, for the poor, for long journeys where nothing fresh would survive. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the story of how this humble peasant food became a symbol of an entire nation gets considerably stranger from here. The turning point for pasta's reputation did not come from a king's decree or a religious conversion the way it so often does with other foods in history. It came from the streets of Naples. By the 18th century, Naples had become one of the most densely populated cities in Europe, and its poorer residents, who could afford little more than bread, had developed an intense and highly visible culture of eating dried macaroni, often bought from street vendors and eaten with the hands, sauced with nothing more than a sprinkle of grated cheese. Travelers to Naples in the 1700s wrote home, sometimes with amusement and sometimes with open disgust, describing crowds of what foreign visitors called lazzaroni, poor Neapolitans eating fistfuls of macaroni directly from carts in the street, tilting their heads back and lowering long strands into their mouths without utensils. Foreign cartoonists and satirists seized on the image, and Naples earned the nickname Mangia Macaroni, the macaroni eaters, a label that started as mockery and eventually became a point of civic pride. Some of these vendors, called macaronari, set up entire street stalls with cauldrons of boiling water kept perpetually hot, serving macaroni cooked to order for whoever had a coin to spare. The plates topped with nothing more than grated hard cheese, since fresh tomato sauce, so closely associated with pasta today, did not become a common pairing until the tomato itself, a New World import, was widely accepted into Italian cooking sometime in the 18th century. Before that point, Neapolitans had been eating dry macaroni for generations without the red sauce most people now consider inseparable from it. This is the part that does not get enough credit in most retellings. It was not aristocrats who made pasta a national food. It was the visible, unapologetic hunger of the Neapolitan poor, turned by outsiders into a stereotype and turned by Neapolitans themselves into an identity. The mechanics of eating that identity, however, were about to be transformed by a piece of cutlery. Eating long noodles by hand, however iconic it looked to foreign visitors, was messy and impractical, and it is here that a genuinely charming, if only partially verifiable legend enters the story. Neapolitan tradition credits a court official or chef in the household of the Bourbon King Ferdinand II sometime around the 1770s with popularizing or perhaps reinventing the four-pronged dinner fork, specifically to make eating long pasta strands more elegant and less of a spectacle for royal guests. Whether every detail of this legend is historically accurate remains debated among food historians, since forks with multiple tines already existed elsewhere in Europe well before this point. But the timing and the association stuck, and the four-tined fork spread through Italy alongside the very food it was supposedly designed to tame. Around the same period, an entirely different kind of turning point was unfolding across the Atlantic. In 1787, the American diplomat and future President Thomas Jefferson, serving as United States Minister to France, made a trip through northern Italy and encountered macaroni for the first time, becoming fascinated enough with the dish that he sketched a diagram of a macaroni extruding machine and later had pasta and Parmesan cheese imported to Monticello, reportedly even serving macaroni and cheese at a state dinner in 1802. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the very food dismissed for centuries as peasant fare in Naples was, within a single generation, being served at the table of an American president. But not every chapter of pasta's history carries this kind of warmth, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as an uninterrupted rise from peasant food to national treasure. The 18th and 19th century pastifici, the pasta workshops of Naples and Torre Annunziata, relied heavily on grueling, physically brutal labor, much of it performed by children as young as 7 or 8, who worked barefoot, kneading dough with their feet in vats for hours at a time, in rooms thick with flour dust and heat from the drying ovens. Contemporary accounts describe conditions that would be classified as outright child labor exploitation by any modern standard, with long shifts, minimal pay, and injuries from the heavy presses that were common and rarely compensated. This was not romantic. It was industrial-era poverty, dressed up in postcards for tourists who found the barefoot kneading picturesque rather than exploitative. And roughly a century and a half later, pasta found itself at the center of a very different kind of dark chapter. This time driven not by poverty, but by nationalist ideology. In the late 1920s, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini launched an aggressive campaign against pasta consumption, part of a broader push toward agricultural self-sufficiency, or autarky, aimed at reducing Italy's dependence on imported wheat. Mussolini's regime, along with the futurist writer Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who published an entire manifesto in 1930 attacking pasta as a food that made Italians sluggish, unpatriotic, and physically weak compared to supposedly more virile rice-eating nations, pushed a coordinated propaganda effort to shift the national diet toward rice, a crop Italy could grow domestically in greater volume. Government officials and doctors were enlisted to claim, without real scientific basis, that pasta caused lethargy and undermined the national character. Here is the uncomfortable reality that most modern retellings gloss over entirely. This was not a fringe food fad. This was the machinery of an authoritarian state attempting to reshape an entire population's diet and identity for the sake of political ideology and wartime resource planning. It failed. Italians kept eating pasta anyway, in open defiance of a regime that controlled nearly every other aspect of public life. Sometimes the most stubborn resistance to a dictatorship comes not from a rebellion, but from a dinner table. And this is the part that does not get enough credit in most retellings, because the darker labor history behind this noodle did not end with the fall of the fascist regime. The durum wheat that makes dried pasta possible still has to be harvested by hand in many of the fields of southern Italy, particularly in the region of Puglia, and journalists and labor organizations have documented for years a system known locally as caporalato, an informal gangmaster network in which largely migrant agricultural workers, many of them undocumented, are recruited, transported, and controlled by intermediaries who take a cut of already meager wages. Investigations by Italian labor authorities and international human rights organizations have described conditions involving excessive hours, unsafe housing, and in the most extreme documented cases, deaths from heat exhaustion during summer harvests. This is not ancient history. This is the wheat that may be sitting in a pasta box in your own cabinet right now. And it is a genuinely uncomfortable thread to pull on. The wartime years that followed brought their own brutal scarcity, with wheat and pasta strictly rationed under fascist and then Allied occupation authorities, and Italian families across the country stretching whatever dried pasta they could ration into meals for entire households, sometimes for weeks at a time. It was not until the post-war economic recovery of the 1950s and 1960s, the period Italians call the economic miracle, that pasta production and consumption exploded back into abundance, aided enormously by a wave of industrial innovation that had actually begun decades earlier and was now ready to scale. In 1878, the French engineers Bonvillain and Ranceret patented a hydraulic pasta press capable of extruding dough through bronze dies under enormous pressure, producing uniform, mass-manufactured shapes far faster and more consistently than any hand-operated press before it. This single invention did for pasta roughly what the cotton gin did for textiles, collapsing production time and unlocking true mass manufacturing. Around the same period, Italian producers solved a second, quieter problem that had limited pasta production to sunny coastal towns for centuries. Traditional pasta drying had relied entirely on the sun and the specific dry winds of towns like Torre Annunziata near Naples, meaning production was seasonal and geographically restricted. The development of artificial, temperature-controlled drying chambers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries broke that dependency entirely, allowing factories to dry pasta reliably indoors year-round anywhere in the world. In 1877, a small flour and bread shop in the northern Italian town of Parma, run by a baker named Pietro Barilla, expanded into pasta production, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the largest pasta manufacturer on Earth. Meanwhile, waves of Italian immigrants leaving poverty and political upheaval for the United States, Argentina, and Brazil between the 1880s and the 1920s carried their pasta-making knowledge with them, planting the foundations of pasta industries on 3 separate continents almost simultaneously. In the United States specifically, Italian immigrant entrepreneurs built the American pasta industry essentially from scratch. An immigrant named Emanuele Ronzoni founded his own pasta company in Brooklyn in 1915, and by the middle of the 20th century, American consumers had also embraced an entirely new category that would have baffled a 19th century Neapolitan street vendor: canned and pre-sauced pasta, exemplified by products introduced in the 1960s that packaged tiny rings of pasta in tomato sauce for children, a far cry from the semolina strands drying in the coastal winds of Torre Annunziata. Here is the twist. The same food that had been mocked as backward peasant fare in 18th century travel writing had, within roughly a century, been simplified, canned, and marketed specifically to American children as a convenient weeknight dinner. Which brings the story to today, and the numbers involved are frankly difficult to fully absorb. Italy alone produces roughly 3.4 million tons of pasta every year and remains by far the world's largest exporter, shipping dried pasta to more than 200 countries. The average Italian eats an estimated 23 kilograms of pasta per year, roughly the weight of a large dog, consumed 1 plate at a time, year after year. Globally, the pasta market is now valued at well over $20 billion annually, and durum wheat, the very grain that made Sicilian dried noodles possible over 1,000 years ago, is still traded internationally as a specialized commodity distinct from ordinary bread wheat, grown heavily in Canada, the United States, and southern Italy and Puglia specifically. But pasta is far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. In recent decades, the specific engineering of pasta shapes has become a genuine field of applied mathematics and food science, with designers and engineers analyzing how the ridges of a rigatoni or the spirals of a fusilli are optimized to trap and hold sauce, essentially treating a noodle the way an aerospace engineer treats the surface of a wing. Researchers have even used computational modeling to design entirely new pasta shapes intended to flat pack for shipping efficiency and then curl into their final form only once boiled, cutting packaging waste at industrial scale. Not bad for a food that, for most of its existence, nobody considered worth writing down. Here is another detail that tends to catch people off guard. Pasta has also made it well beyond the dinner table and even beyond Earth's atmosphere. Specially formulated compact pasta dishes have been included in the meal rotations of astronauts aboard the International Space Station, engineered to avoid the crumbs and loose particles that could otherwise float dangerously through a zero-gravity cabin and interfere with delicate equipment. Back on the ground, pasta has become a favorite subject for large-scale novelty and record chasing as well, with Guinness World Records having certified feats ranging from the longest single strand of cooked spaghetti ever measured to enormous communal bowls of pasta prepared for tens of thousands of people at food festivals across Italy and the United States. None of this would have made any sense to a Neapolitan street vendor in 1750. Ladling macaroni from a cart for pennies. And yet it is the same wheat, the same water, and largely the same basic technique, simply carried a few thousand years further down the road. So think about the full arc of it. It was there in a flooded Bronze Age village in China, tangled in a bowl beneath 10 feet of river silt. It was there in Roman kitchens, cut into flat, baked sheets that barely resembled the noodle you know today. It was there in the fields and workshops of Norman Sicily, loaded onto ships in Trebia, traveling the Mediterranean a full century before a Venetian merchant ever set foot near a Chinese noodle stall. It was there in the holds of Genoese merchant ships, feeding sailors and soldiers who had nothing else that would keep. It was there in the crowded streets of Naples, eaten by hand by people the wealthy mocked in cartoons, and then, eventually, imitated at their own tables. It was there at Monticello, on an American president's dinner table, a peasant food elevated by curiosity rather than decree. It was there, in the barefoot labor of children kneading dough in overheated Neapolitan workshops. And it was there, in the propaganda offices of a fascist government that tried, and failed, to legislate it out of an entire nation's identity. It was there in a hydraulic press patented in 1878, and it is there today in the sun-scorched wheat fields of Puglia, where the labor behind your dinner is still not entirely fair. It was there, deliberately engineered ridge by ridge in a food science laboratory testing sauce adhesion just a few years ago. And it was there, quietly, in a sealed pouch aboard the International Space Station, 300 miles above the country where a marketing writer once invented a myth about where it came from. And it is there right now, almost certainly, somewhere in your own kitchen cabinet, in a box that costs perhaps $2, waiting for a pot of boiling water. Not bad for a noodle that started life stuck in flood mud on the banks of a river in China, 4,000 years before anyone thought to write its story down. If any part of this surprised you, I would genuinely love to know which one. So do me a favor and leave a comment telling me. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.